Over the last few years, it sure seems like we've had a lot of sudden death syndrome in soybeans showing up in areas of the country that it never was before. So what can you do to manage this disease on your farm?
Well, the problem with sudden death syndrome is we don't have resistant varieties. So if we just had varieties that we could plant that completely stop sudden death syndrome, that would be awesome. Or if we had treatments that we could put on the crop. So you know what? All I have to do is put on a seed treatment or put on a foliar treatment and I don't have to worry about sudden death anymore. Well, we don't have that either. So the easy options aren't there. That means it has to get just a little bit complicated in terms of some of the cultural things that we do out in the field, and then getting down to managing that crop and the inputs we choose.
Okay, the first thing is you have probably heard, hey, plant your soybeans later and you'll have less sudden death syndrome.
You will.
Yes, and that is true. But here's the problem. When you plant later, you also give up yield. The earlier planting yields more. So here's what we suggest for you on your farm. Take your fields where you've never had any sudden death issue, you're not too worried about it, and where you're going to plant your most tolerant varieties. Plant those first, but don't delay planting. Get out there and get those planted, and then as your planting season progresses, you want to continue to go to your fields that have had the most problem last. So again, we don't suggest delaying those. You can certainly do that, but like we say, the issue is the more you delay planting, the more you sacrifice yield just from planting date. So what we would suggest instead is use some other practices on those acres to hopefully help you, even if your variety isn't necessarily super tolerant and even if your field has had issues in the past.
All right, now that is one thing to think about, is past issues. So if you have a field that has had sudden death syndrome in the past, use crop rotation. So if you're in a situation where, hey, I can rotate away to a crop like corn or wheat where sudden death syndrome is not going to be a problem for me, do it. That's a good thing. Even a year off of that field is a good thing for you. If you're in continuous soybeans, you're going to take a lot more risk of having an increase in sudden death syndrome pressure in your field. So crop rotation is a good thing for you. Tillage can help a little bit. I don't think it's the biggest answer. To me, a bigger cultural answer may be drainage. Where we're seeing more sudden death syndrome is in poorly drained, heavier ground. And not always, it can be in different types of ground. But if you've got poor drainage, you're going to see more issues with fusarium-caused diseases like sudden death syndrome. So avoid that. Improve your drainage. And you may say, well, I already have pattern tile out there. I've got drainage. No, you don't. You've got 100-foot spacing or you got 50-foot spacing. They're too wide and you're still seeing problems in between. So you may have to narrow it up. Or you say, well, I've got kind of rolly ground. I really shouldn't have to narrow it up. Maybe you do just in those lower spots, just in those poorly drained lower areas where water sits a little bit more. Put more tile in that spot. Yeah, you may not have to on the sandy hill or the well-drained hills, but in the low spots you do.
Earlier, Darren said that seed treatments aren't a perfect option, but at least now we have some seed treatments that are an option. Myrtec seems to so far be okay, but the better choice does seem to be Alivo, and you can certainly look in your area at information there and data there in your area what's really panned out, but it looks to us like Alivo is a pretty good option. Now, the only thing is Alivo costs more than Myrtec, so you can weigh those things out. But either way, you're not going to get 100% perfect control on sudden death syndrome, but it definitely reduces your risk. So that's something you can look at going into this coming year.
There's another seed treatment that we should talk about too, and it's kind of a way around sudden death syndrome. It's Chloriva. What Chloriva does is it stops the nematodes. And when we get nematode feeding in the roots, we have more issues with sudden death syndrome and other diseases. So we're seeing a reduction in sudden death syndrome in fields where guys are using Chloriva. So we see many guys using Chloriva Complete and adding some Myrtec in there, and they seem to be doing a pretty good job. But again, as we said, it's not the total answer. But hey, if you're thinking about, I've got some nematode pressure, I may try that. An improvement in sudden death syndrome could be another benefit that you get.
All right, I got two more suggestions for you. Number one, use a fungicide. Fortix actually has a suppression label on sudden death syndrome, so that's an option. And you know, it just flat out means having better overall plant health. So my option number two for you is fertility. If you have a good fertility program, you should have a healthier plant that's more tolerant of diseases. I think about micronutrients especially, like copper, for example. And I have no data yet to support this, but I think over time we'll find out that, hey, if I've fed my crop well, I have less chance for sudden death syndrome. But I come back to copper because copper is kind of known as the disease nutrient. Well, do you have good copper levels in your soil? Might be something for you to look at. Copper, the other micronutrients, and then, you know, obviously potassium, phosphorus, all those things. Feed your plant well. It's it's going to be more tolerant to all diseases.
All right, and speaking of tolerance, when we look at soybean varieties, the breeders have gotten some great data over the last 10 years, unfortunately, because that means we've got lots of pressure out in the fields. But they've gotten some great data and they made some excellent selections. And we're finding families now that have much better tolerance to sudden death syndrome. So make sure you ask your seed dealer about this, because in any seed dealer's lineup, there's going to be some numbers that aren't very good on sudden death and others that are really pretty tolerant. So take those tolerant ones, as Brian said, put them as the early part of your program, so maybe your full season varieties that get planted first. Then later on, you can work in some of those products that maybe don't have as good a tolerance, but they're really nice racehorse yielding varieties. You can save them, plant them at the end of your soybean planting. And again, we don't recommend delaying your planting window. If you're saying, normally I plant all my beans between May 1st and May 10th, great. Plant your sudden death syndrome fields last. Start with your fields where you don't have a problem first on May 1st. Then maybe by the time you get to May 8th, 9th, and 10th, you can plant those fields that you have some problems here and there.
Yep, at least we do have some options now for sudden death syndrome. We know better how to manage this program, so just take advantage of some of those things on your farm. Well, another thing you're going to want to do if you want to have good yields, period, is control our weed of the week. Can you identify this week's weed?